I took the invitation right, that the request is to say something about what could be gained if the analysis of global educational policy would draw on theoretical means that are provided by modern systems theory, elaborated by the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who lived from 1927 to 1998. And what do we win instead of applying the usual approaches of neo-institutionalism or neo-Marxist approaches or interaction network theories or things like that? Does Luhmann, that's the question, does Luhmann, who never himself was engaged in global education policy, offer an alternative framework for understanding globalization, which could be used also for our field of interest? The exchange of the theoretical construction in a quasi-experimental attitude is driven by the expectation that one may shift the blind spot of every theory to cope with and thus see something new. So to come to the first point, which is about some caveats of which have to be made before we go deeper into the theory of social systems. To inhibit a misinterpretation which might be obvious in an Anglo-American context, preliminary, I want to emphasize that Niklas Luhmann's systems theories is not the perpetuation of Parsons' theory of social systems. Even if Luhmann was a scholar at Harvard and with Parsons, he totally turned the perspective. Where Parsons constructs society as integrated by a set of central values, all systems, in his view, eagerly contributing to the functioning of the society, Luhmann in a reverse perspective, conceptualizes the modern functionally differentiated society as composed of specialized social systems like economy, law, judicial system, health, medical care, science, education, sports, and so forth, that tend to drift apart. Each of them is following its own operational logic, careless about the effects on the environment that is on the other social systems. Social systems develop their own set of practices, which we also might call cultures, and to solve specific problems, to fulfill their task, to provide output, and most important, to reproduce themselves. For Luhmann, the main characteristic of the modern society thus is decentralization. All systems are in a network-like relation. They are equally important because nowhere else their tasks can be carried out. Lawyers cannot educate, educators not cure illnesses or run businesses, or politicians dispense justice, and so forth. There is no hierarchy. None of the systems is superior to another. This is especially true for the political system. And here I have to make a side remark about terminology. In Germany, one would say the Politiksystem, and the word Politik, in the German word Politik, cannot be translated because in English you have three words like polity, policy, and politics. And it is all in the German word Politik. So the politic system, or the system of politic, I cannot really translate. So I speak about the political system that tries to around this. If one system fails in the perspective of this theory, all the other systems have to compensate the flaw. complexity of the society has grown to an extent that, that unity is dispersed into multiple diverging partial rationalities which exclude each other. Quote, "The principle of differentiation of the modern society makes the demand for rationality indispensable, but, so Luhmann laconically, at once irresolvable. Given the decentralization of the society, Luhmann's theory observes from a kind of a bird-eye perspective the emergence of social order out of the chaos, anticipating an open, unpredictable future." I need some water. Thus, I talked about the unpredictable future. Thus, systems theory starts, and this is very important, with the notion of improbability of modern society. It typically does not ask why, but how questions, and especially how is the society's further existence ensured, including the potentiality that the evolution has not a good end. To add another caveat, Luhmann's theory also is not a conflict theory. It was developed as it was developed by neo-Marxist critical theory or even liberal approaches in opposition to Parsons' idea of balance and stability. It is not about conflicting interests. It is not focused on individual or collective actors who are more or less influential. Luhmann does not consider social dynamic and change as a result of antagonistic action. That is not to say that there are no actors or motives or interests or conflicts. In contrast, systems theory is about structures and different logics that exist and persist independently from actors' intentions and their interests. Actors and their motives, intentions or interests are only real if they are perceived by a social system and used in the communication of a social system. This is a very important change of the perspective. In Luhmann's theory, the key concept is communication and sense. Distinct from Parsons, Luhmann's theory is not a theory, as I already said, about social action or about intentions. The modus of operation in all social systems is communication as an autopoietic operation concerned with the continuation of itself, again, self-reference. A system is real only if it operates. Our daily experience teaches us that we do not conduct a conversation, but the conversation carries us to surprising results sometimes. Communication takes place between and within social systems in specific media like money, right, truth, power, for example. Luhmann's prime theoretical focus is on the system's communications. He asks for the conditions under which systems make use of, for example, under which conditions they make use of individuals, that is, how do they include them to complete their tasks. For give you an example, a school is a school even without students or with an exchange population or replaced programs. However, there are no students or teachers without school, and there is no school without pedagogical communication operated. I will come back to the exchange of the theoretical tools and the difference that it makes to reset action by communication later in this talk. I'm now looking at the question of world society. Looking at the phenomenon of globalization, neo-institutionalists start with different systems which they identify with nation states, thus merging state, people, and society, and then register adjustment along rationality patterns. The theoretical decision to put nation states and their behavior in the focus permits those approaches in alignment with common sense to conceptualize various culturally different national societies, the Indian, the American, the Italian society, in plural. A brief glance into any metropolis in the world shows that the assumption is empirically invalid. Neo-institutionalists then try to understand the convergence, similarities, standardizations of the solutions, practices implemented in different nation states. You all know about isomorphism as an assertion of rationality. In contrast, systems theory starts with the notion of one world society composed of social world systems that have different tasks to fulfill: economy, polity, health, science, religion, sports, media, and so forth. And education too. In Luhmann's view, world society is a dynamic communication system of symbolic generalized sociality. The theory of functional differentiation presupposes globalization beginning in the 15th or 16th century as a given. Everywhere on Earth, the specialized functional system have to solve the same problems. The economy system has to supply subsistence goods, the medical system should provide physical or psychical health, the political system is expected to deliver security, and the education system has to solve the problem of succession of generations. The basic question is, for education, how to staff the society's organizations in the various systems with changing personnel. Starting with the notion of world society, the theory charge then is to explain how local and regional differences in institutions, practices, and organizations and interactions come about. Overcoming methodological nationalism is the first benefit gained from this rearrangement of the explanans and the explanandum. Decisive cultural differences then are attributed to the functional system and not predominantly to the nation. Teachers, scientists, physicians, or soccer players, managers, or religious leaders have more in common than characteristics that would distinguish them along national lines. Even if the practices, routines, and institutions in those systems may locally differ and be ethnoculturally impregnated. So that was the topic we were yesterday talking in context of Tobin's idea. And the question is, how do you attribute the differences you find within specialized functional systems like education on the local level? Is it always nation or is it something else? The next point is what is the idea of the political system exposed by systems theory? From the point of view of systems theory, global education policy analysis is focusing the word system of political communication and not the education system. Again, education is an issue only in as far as it is observed and perceived in the communication of the political system. The focus about which the political system is built is political power, organized around political agency, allocated in state administrations at the operative level. Power appears everywhere in the society. Political power has to be distinguished from other forms of social pressure, influence, which will occur in all the other systems too. One source of legitimation of political authority would be democracy. Power then is derived from the polls. But there are other sources, like military force. Legitimation comes out of guns, or expertise based on scientific knowledge. Not to forget religion as another source of power. Obviously, the political system is different from the world system of economy, the world health, the education or science system, or worldwide family building. The political communication takes place on the level of organizations and professions. The media of communication are money, right, power, but also semantics. Observing the social evolution, the task of the political system is to provide the world society with collectively binding and conclusive decisions to ensure the society's continuation. In the reverse, the political system itself is confronted with the non-political power of predominantly economic constraints, but also demographic changes and scientific or technical innovations that enforce adaptation and restructuring. For centuries, the political world system internally was differentiated in what is called territorial states. Luhmann calls this a, quote, segmental second-order differentiation. So we have functional differentiation and we have old forms of segmental differentiations, which are territorial states. The political communication depends, as we know, on communication technologies. It started with print, which means there was first time one was able to communicate among absentees, and now we have our new technologies, dissolving spatial restrictions. To become operative, the world polity system is reliant on the states, which are not only addressees in an international communication, but due to their monopoly of force, allocate the power of self-assertion and effectiveness. The threat of anarchy is the reason why the world polity system still is concerned to guarantee statism. This is an expression of Bakunin everywhere. Until now, states and their administrations are the most important operative tools of the world policy system. In reverse, and that is the new development, states become more and more dependent from the political system of the world society in as much as it developed new structures. Despite the states, since the second half of the 20th century, transnational, international, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, operational foundations, donor organizations develop into increased influence. They are an indicator for the ongoing internal differentiation of the system and a proof that the notion of world society is incorporated into the self-description of the system. The system reinvents itself. The task of these organizations is problem identification, definition, program development, coordination, and agenda setting. Concerned with various self-defined problems in the world society like social justice, social market or green economy, human rights, equality of chances, and in education. Luhmann would call these concepts political utopias that frame political programs for longer times. Concerned with these political utopias, these organizations try to bring the states into line with their notion of problem solving, notwithstanding the option of labeling pariah states that are excluded from the international community. To some extent, relieving for the nation states is that all these issues are contested, thus creating advocates for every position possible. However, these are maybe endowed with more or less power. Distinct from at least a majority of states, the non-state organizations have no electorate and thus no democratic legitimation. In many cases, like the Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the WTO, OECD, and so even the EU, the stakeholders of these organizations are what euphemistically is called the markets. In as much as the democratic states, as as borrowers, have to conform to the expectations of the lender, that is the owner of the capital, they de facto are confronted with the expectation of a kind of a second constituency, which structurally is at odds with the electorate. This is taken from a new, recently published book of a German sociologist who analyzes the various financial crisis in the world. It would be another talk to go deeper into the new constellation which has become visible in the public in the not-ending sequences of crisis summits organized by the international finance diplomacy since 2008, also discussed under the title of post-democracy. Now, what is about communication and causality? The subject matter of global education policy analysis is the political system, as I already said, in the dimensions of polity, policy, and politics of the world society, and the relation between the new and old organizations like states and NGOs, EOs, and so forth. Within the system, the idea is it's one system, and in the system there's a certain new form of differentiation. Near to the self-description of the participants, the actors in the field, global education policy analysis often focuses on the political intervention into national education policies, not into the education system itself, eliciting a hierarchical order together with something like top-down activities. Most authors, so far as I have read, like participants, implicitly accept the control aspirations that accompany political action that strives for an effect and thereby take over causality assumptions that guide them. Focusing the success or failure of global education policies, some authors bother about the effectiveness or failure of governing techniques. others identify with the subjects of global policy, namely the poor states, and show some sympathy for their resistance or cleverness in reinterpreting the external expectations. In large, the aim of research is to understand, as Gita puts it, quote, the disjunctures that occur between global education policy and local recontextualizations. Quote. At this point of the argument, the importance of Luhmann's theoretical redisposition from behavior, respectively action, to communication becomes obvious. If for methodological reasons, global education policy analysis is not reduced to a simple model of behavior which may be manipulated by technical means, as the theory of behavioral economy suggests, if the analysis does not just take on the self-descriptions of the actors observed, we have to look for a more complex heuristic to describe from a position of a clinical observer the social reality of global education policy. The concept of communication offers an alternative, to my opinion, alternative theoretical frame to describe the operations of the political system realistically. Communication is composed of two elements, information and transmission. Also, informations are not only transmitted, but become information not until the receiver, the addressee, produces actively the information as in an act of understanding. The further proceeding of the communication depends on how the addressee understands. In this sense, even misunderstanding is a way of understanding that directs further communication. This notion of communication introduces a non-linear model for the analysis of social processes, recognizing the characteristic of double contingency, which means that both sender and receiver are capable of learning. They perpetually change their state of knowledge, with the result that they react to new inputs with non-predictable outputs. All political, that is, normative interventions in functional systems, economy, health, education, what to take, or their organizations rely on power. Power, in a common sense notion, is related to causality. Those in power try to dispose about effects. Results are considered as the impact of the action. So you do something and you have an effect and then you attribute it to yourself. This concept of power, which is the self-description of the powerful, collides with a theoretical insight that social systems are not determined by causality. Causality presupposes the distinction of causes and effects. In complex social systems, the array of possible causes and possible effects is endless and unclear. The longer the time horizon is extended into the past and the future, the more causes and effects appear. Thus, causality has to be created by an observer in form of an attribution. We all know in empirical research when we have variables and we have correlations and then we have to ask what is the causality? Is it the one way or the other way around? And so it's the observer who decides what's the causality. driven by theory, naturally, or practical political needs. It is a scheme of observation. Causality is a scheme of observation. Any action has to be instructed by simplified false, maybe false causal plans. Otherwise, action would be blocked. We can now, and this is the message of today, we can now reformulate the research question for global education policy analysis. What policymakers try to do from this perspective is to obtain causal effects by communication. Given the structure of communication, this is impossible, but without alternative. By the way, this is also true for education or any other attempt to influence the behavior of other actors or systems who have to learn or get healthy or eat by themselves. The question of sociological interest is how, and this is the question for research, for empirical research, the question is how the paradox is dissolved in reality of global education policy. I close with a quote of Niklas Luhmann from his essay on die Politik der Gesellschaft. It's my translation. Quote, "That policy matters is not to be doubted, nor can be denied that governance is not successful to change and determine the state of systems in the desired direction. The theory of self-referential systems at least offers a proposal how to cope with this state of facts on the level of description comparing different functional systems. Simultaneously, this theoretical tool comprises the renouncement of directive policy advice. All communication addressed to the political system can only consist of the demand to adopt the system's self-descriptions to the conditions which are given in the modern society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Frank. I agreed with Professor Tamar Rappaport, who will be the discussant, and Frank, that I would also say 5 minutes something, and then Tamar 5 minutes. My job is basically to culturally translate a very dense and very interesting talk in the good German tradition of a healthy dose of theory into American academic environment. So let me just highlight 3 points that I think for my colleagues that come from a US background will be interesting. One is, I think, what the systems theory shows, and you very beautifully presented, is it is an institutional theory, or it's organizational, it has relationships to organizational sociology. The whole idea of functional differentiation, that there are different subsystems or sectors that have own functions and their own logic. The education system has its own logic, the economic system has its own logic, the religious system has its own logic, that's the functional differentiation process of society. And this has huge repercussions in comparative and international education. And I think also in that discussion with anthropologists. The first one is that what you say, what Luhmann says, that they have their own operational logic. And that, I know many colleagues here in my own department work on that, and I'm sure other colleagues that are here too also, and students. I know Regina works on the logic of donors, the logic of actually the German GIZ, German International Technical Assistance. I know anthropologists, the more enlightened version of anthropology, I'm seeing Leslie and Hervé and Chuck. The way they see it at TC, the anthropologists, it's a meaning-producing entity, culture. So systems are culture, systems are context. They have their own meaning. They have their own operational logic, as Luhmann says. You said it somewhere. And this has huge repercussions for everything, actually, we do. For instance, another way of what Tony Berger and Karen are working on when they talk about criticism of neoliberal reforms, another way of saying is to say that the subsystem, the education subsystem, has borrowed for political reasons, or now that's the problem that in English politics, how you translate it, for partisan reasons, we would say, has borrowed the operational logic of the economic system. And that's how neoliberalization of education happened, by taking something, because the operational logic of education is justice, is individuality, and other operational logic. But that's a borrowing process. Could be translated as a borrowing process. Another thought, and I should leave it here, when we talk about communication. Systems theory talks about the importance of communication. And to the education system, the economic system is environment, and it communicates with the economic system. It communicates with the religious system. And coming from policy borrowing and lending research, communication, as you say, has two parts, information and transmission. In policy borrowing and lending research, we would say it has two parts, reception and translation. And it's just like putting it in a different language. I'm trying to translate you culturally into research that several of us work. Finally, the last thing I wanted to say, that link, because this symposium is called Culture and Context, but I think we could also call it culture, context, and systems, because systems have their own culture, or are their own culture, and are their own context. And Luhmann, and that's where Schriever, our German colleague Schriever, works a lot. Sometimes when there's a lack of, there's confusion on meaning, he would say there's a need to create a Zusatzsinn, Zusatzsinn, additional meaning. And additional meaning is created by borrowing or externalization. That's just a way, trying to use terms that we are familiar with and integrated here. I've spoken more than 5 minutes, I think, and I want to pass the floor to Tamar Rappaport. She's a visiting scholar at Teachers College. She teaches in the Department of Education Policy and Social Analysis. She has a background in sociology of education, and she's the perfect person to comment on Frank's presentation.
Thank you very much for an interesting lecture. I didn't coordinate with Gita. I'm shocked because we kind of are going to talk about the same concept without coordinating, so it's very interesting. So I'll start by following 3 assumptions of Gita and then move a little bit to my empirical research, or some theoretical and empirical research that is trying to apply your theory to more mundane life. The first one is, I was a student of Eisenstadt, Shmuel Eisenstadt, an Israeli sociologist who developed, following Parsons, the idea of differentiation, and the operational logic of different systems. So I studied when I was a student. That was many, many years ago. But I had contact with him all his life, so I know what he thought. The next assumption, produce meaning and have their own cultures and logic. And the third one is reception theory, which I think you talked about in the end of your when you talked about communication, about which is, developed now not only in sociology, but also in literature and in anthropology and in other fields. I'm not a macro-sociologist anymore. I converted to ethnography. It was a long process of conversion. It's almost a religious conversion. It took place together with my conversion to being a feminist theorist and empirical research. So I'm not going to comment on the big idea, on the big macro ideas that you presented, but as I said before, I'll move to more kind of meso or micro level of analysis. I will start by saying that I can see how your theoretical frame, or Luhmann's theoretical framework, can be applied to the analysis of socialization structures. I read what you say as, not only as Gita said, in terms of organizational theory, but also in terms of structuralism. I think there is a strong component of structure or code in the code of different structures when you present the idea of systems. Because I used to study informal organization and develop a theory and empirical research for many years about informal association and organization, and try to think about the constitutive codes of different socialization agents or arena. And I think all of us will agree that the three main socialization agencies or arenas, family, school, and let's say peer group or informal associations, have different codes of operations. The family is basically based on intimacy, and the school is based on, the code of school is transmitting knowledge, and the code of informal association, I think, is what I call sociability, or let's say relations based on trust. And this is kind of a theoretical model, and I agree with what you say, that in an ideal model they are differentiated. But I think in real life they are merging more and more, the three agencies. And I'll give some, and also I agree with you that when the code is dissolved, or let's say in a family that we call in modern times, the family doesn't function anymore, it means that there is no intimacy. It doesn't mean that there are not people and children and parents, but it means that the intimacy is not anymore there. And then the family doesn't have a right to exist anymore. And then the intervention comes in. Policy intervention comes in to correct or to rebuild or to renovate the intimacy in the family. This is also true about school and about other associations. When delinquency, whatever it's called by Chicago School, I just taught it last week, juvenile delinquency or whatever, then this organization does not really manage us anymore according to the code, and then we have intervention. So I think we can talk about interventions and policy making in terms of codes of different systems, as I said before, these codes are merging now. We have homeschooling now, where the school and home are the code of intimacy and the code of transmitting knowledge merge. We have now in families that are becoming schools that are like in Finland, as we know, are taking the role of being caretakers and are kind of taking the idea of family and bringing it into the school. So I think that when we think about intervention, I'm not a policy person, but we have to think about the idea of the intervention in terms of these different contexts. I myself studied, it's too long, so I stop. Just one sentence. Okay, I can stop abruptly. I studied myself a Palestinian village and an intervention program with mothers and children. And in this program, what I call the codes of intimacy and family were kind of communicated together. The wonderful thing about this program is that it brought the women, the mothers, to resist the system. So the patriarchal system. And the main question that I was dealing with is really what are the main codes of intervention or logic of intervention in policy and intervention program. Sorry for taking. Sit here.
Yeah, maybe.
I think you should talk here, because we have video recording.
Okay. I pick up the point you made about the logics and the relation between social systems and what you call cultures. Mm-hmm. And yes, I would agree. If you take culture as the instruction of action, then the logic of a social system is the same idea. The logic of a system instructs the action of those who are included in the system. If you are a faculty member, you have to behave like a faculty member, and you have some, but you cannot behave like any other role model from another functional system. And that was in my talk that I say I'm convinced that the differences between certain types of action or certain types of actors are relying on the social, more on the social systems than on any other kind of differentiation, which also might be part of the social reality, as for example nations or something like that. So the logic of a system is the instruction of action. And if you are in the educational system, then you have to educate. And education is a specific problem, which is on two levels operationalized. It is in organizations, it's public education, and it's in families. It's socialization or private education. But it's always the same problem, to influence the behavior of the child by communication. And how do you solve this problem, which, as I've tried to point out, is to be done without causality. What the teacher tries to do is impossible, Luhmann says in one passage, But he is forced to do it. So how do we cope with this paradoxical situation?
Because he doesn't know whether he was successful.
He has no. He cannot. The student has to learn himself. You cannot learn. To make him learn, but you can exercise some kind of power in the sense that you restrict his options to respond, but you cannot, as you cannot eat for anybody else. So this is the structural problem of education, and this is in public education the same as in. So when we think of social systems, then we think about three levels: the system level, the level of organization, and the level of interaction. And on all these three levels, you have the same problem. So the other question was, what happens if you made the example of the economic system invades, let's say, the educational system. That can happen. But if you take a closer look, then you see the economization of education, as one might say, has to stop at the moment where it is about education. So you can implement new governance strategies in the educational system, like testing, things like that. But the core problem of education is still the same. And if you destroy the logic of this educational problem, then there's a real problem. Then the system might collapse, as we have the example from politicization economy. When you politize economy to an extent where the logic of economy is destroyed, then it doesn't work. So there's a real barrier against invasion of other social systems. So always they try it. I mean, there's politicization of education, there's economization of education, but at the end, the system which has to fulfill the task of education cannot be, it has to be protected from this. And in this sense, I mean, one can be optimistic because there are always attempts to overwhelm one system by another, but after a while this will
dissipate. So let me open the floor to everyone. We only have, let's say, we extended by like 5 to 10 minutes. I know Susan Wieborg wants to say something. Karen, you go ahead, Karen. You're on your way to the mic? Okay, please.
Sure.
Maybe speak here. Come here. Sit here. If you don't mind. This one works well.
Please. Then I get to ask you face to face. That's even better. I think what I'm going to say will probably reveal that I've been heavily influenced by another German tradition than the one that you draw on. And I'm sure those in the audience who know this tradition will realize it very quickly. I think that Tony Verger and I were talking today. He does great diagrams, and I'd love to see a visual representation of Luhmann's theory. But I want to understand a little better is how does Luhmann contend with the alternative view, which doesn't negate the notion of differentiation in different systems, but would argue that the subsystem, that is the thing underneath the differentiated systems, is always political economy. I find it very hard to imagine that change occurs within subsystems, not linked together by a substructure that is dominated by the allocation of resources and the allocation of voice. So that leads me to my second question, which is really, your notion of communication is, I think, quite different than a theory of communicative action that has that fundamental notion of a substrata in which voice and resources shape the differentiation within each system. And I wonder then if you could compare Luhmann's communication and Habermas's notion of communication. So that makes it a very big question.
Oh, that,
Can I ask that you maybe also take two more and then answer, because otherwise, I know Susan, you please, and if you want, and maybe you should sit there so you have the camera also, and then we take one more.
Is it working? All right. Well, I have just one question. I know that I will probably reveal my ignorance about Niklas Luhmann, but I will take the chance. But one thing that occurred to me was what you said about that the Luhmann's theory is not about conflict. So my question is to you, why did he omit conflict from his development of his theory? Because he was an observer of the German society, which is conflict-ridden at systems, at the political level and the wider societal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does any invite the floor to any anthropologists want to comment? Eric, do you allow that I take Erwin? Yes, Erwin.
you there.
I think we should do over here on the camera.
Can you be in the two places at the same time?
Oh, I'll try. Yes, I guess my question is related to your question, but on the other side. That is, what do you mean by communication? That is the theory of communication. I mean, as an anthropologist trained with Levi-Strauss and actually conversion analysis and so on and so forth, and Bateson, I'm completely comfortable with communication. Then the question becomes, what is the communication theory that comes in there? And just to reveal one of my sources, I've taught 2 weeks ago Jacobson's theory of communication, which I hope my students think is the most important lecture in a course on culture and communication, because it provides sort of guidance as to communication at macro levels as well as at micro levels.
I think, and many other people have critiqued it, in the absence of understanding exactly what goes on in many other parts of the world, but rather the ideal type was understood to be something that you could say, if certain elements are missing, then these are the elements you would expect to find in more traditional societies, even though there was really no understanding about the empirical realities of many of these places. So I raise this as let's say, as a metaphor, because I spent 4 years at UNESCO. And when I hear people talk about the construction of global education policies, I have this sense that they create these kind of ideal type models about what goes on in these, these international organizations that are involved in the construction of educational policies. And when I think about the kinds of phenomena that I experienced, although I wasn't trained as an anthropologist, but there's so many discontinuities. There's so many things that really don't fit the kind of model that you put forward as how an organization such as one that is in the business of creating global education policy works, and whether or not it really is trying to deal with causation, how much of the internal kind of machinations that go on are completely divorced from the realities of the world in which it's communicating with. And many of the people that are involved there have absolutely no expertise in education, but they're involved in the social construction of global education policies. Or, for example, that much of the work that gets done is actually commissioned by outside people that are not really, that are only nominally connected, to an organization such as UNESCO, and then used in order to feed into the policies that they develop. Or that they see themselves as, let's say, an organization that provides multiple logics or multiple kind of alternative policies, rather than saying that this is the only way things should go. So when I think, very superficially about some of the realities that I experienced at UNESCO, I don't see well developed in the conceptualization that you provide an understanding of the realities that I experienced.
It's all tough comments and interesting, heated debates.
Yes, that's a lot of. I try to put this together in stressing that. Why was I talking about communication? It was the idea was to stress the role and the impact of the recipient, of the addressee or the receiver. In policy making, the underlying models of policy making are mostly action in the sense of you have an impact on, you dispose about causes. And communication theory in different variations is about that there is a autonomy on the side of the receiver of the message of the transmission, and that he is constructing himself what is his understanding of. Then that's about the context and that was my idea. I couldn't go more deep into what is communication, and it's I think it's different from totally different from Habermas-Janen's idea of, you communicate to end up with some consensus, and you have rules to Luhmann would say it's double contingency. How you understand is open, and you may restrict the options you have to continue. But anyway, it's an open and non-teleological process, and that makes it. That causes the notion that there are effects, but also perverse effects you didn't want, and so you get into this. And to make another point, which was there's, if we look at the results of, let's say, in Germany, 20 years of new governance in education with the economic ideas implemented in the educational system, then now there is a disappointment on the side of the politicians who enacted this policy, because the level of education isn't reached at all. There is no change on interaction in the classroom, no better results in tests and so forth and so on. But what we have all these institutions of evaluation, testing organizations, and so forth and so forth. But nothing has happened on the level of real education, of the interaction level of education. But education is education. And teachers do it, and students do it, and we can analyze it. That was your question. I did not research in family education or socialization, but in school, on the lesson level, of teaching level, what happens there? And you can see it's a emerging communication between the teacher and the class, and the outcome is unpredictable. And there is certain modes of, directing the communication, trying to restrict the options that the students have, or create an environment where they, and so forth. You all know about this, but you can reformulate this in terms of communication. And again, it is to make a difference to all ideas of action and causality, and that was in the short outline I could give you. This was the idea to think about how can we restructure the research field when we don't start with the self-descriptions of the politicians who have the illusion that they dispose about effects. That's
okay. Thank you so much. I think your talk was so dense that once we see it on paper, it will help us to think more about it and discuss it. And I would like to say that some are informed me that the current issues of comparative education, which is a student-run journal, would love to publish in one form or the other the 4 presentations that were given. Having said that, thank you so much, Tamar, for your comments, and everyone for your thoughtful and provocative questions.